Good morning. This is an interview being conducted by the Veterans History Project and the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. And we have the privilege this morning of interviewing Richard Charles, who was an ensign in the Navy and then became a captain and had a remarkable career that we'll would like to learn a little bit more about this morning. So this is taking place here in the Library of Fairhope, Alabama. And my name is Glenn Boom, and there are some other guests in the group here that I don't remember the names, frankly. But I'd like to have you start and bring us up to date on where you were born, Dick, and a little bit about your family background. I think you indicated your father was an artist, and surprised me because of Detroit being an automobile.
Well, Detroit, yes, I was born in 1933 in Detroit, Michigan at Henry Ford Hospital. And Dad was a commercial artist, and of course, during the periods that of growth from 33 up through World War II, I had a lonely life at home. And then along came a sister when I was about 8 years old. And unfortunately, Carol, my sister, who's still living up in Detroit at an assisted living place, was born with spina bifida. She was supposed to be a twin. The other child was attached to her spine. And spina bifida, of course, is a snake-like S-shaped curve, and that crippled her for life. So anyway, my life changed after that. I spent most of World War II building models. I had a model of every airplane, every tank, every gun. I had a full collection of models at home.
Wow.
And my sister went through many operations, and of course that was a big load financially on the family, and Dad being a commercial artist, you know how artists are always starving, according to the populace. At any rate, we had tough times during that period. I went through high school locally in Berkeley High School, graduated in 1951, and my class was 110. Mostly the ladies were up in the upper 10 or 15%. I was one of the few males that slipped into the 10%, upper 10%. So anyway, I was quite happy with that, and we went back for my 55th high school reunion just a few years ago. After finishing high school, I was preparing really for a career in architecture. I was fascinated with architecture. Since Dad was an artist, it sort of boiled over to me in the concept of, can I design buildings? Well, I got a call from our local representative, Don Darrow by name, saying, I have 2 appointments available to me, one for West Point, one for Annapolis. Would you like to select one of those? I said, can I call you back in about 2 hours? And he said, sure. So I sat down, talked to my mom and dad. I said, I've always had a desire to go to sea. I'd really like to get into the nuclear business because after I finish a naval career, I can probably step out into the nuclear business, generating electric power for the nation. Well, it really turned out that way in the end. And I did get an appointment to the Naval Academy, entering in 1953. And what I remember in going for plebe year that summer was arriving in Washington and staying in a hotel that had no air conditioning. And I laid down to go to sleep, and we were to report Monday, and I got there on Saturday. And when I got up in the morning, I could see my total outline on the sheets because they were soaking wet with no air conditioning. Anyway, started plebe year, which was nice it was tough, but it was really a challenge. And we had motor whaleboats, we had VP, we had twin screwed VP maneuvering craft to teach you all the basic seamanship skills, and marching and shooting guns at targets and with the M1 rifle. And it was a tough summer, but I was ready for the first class to come back and start their hazing. So anyway, went through that 3 years of that, and it went by like yesterday. And I had a double inguinal hernia, and when my sister was born, my family didn't have enough money to get it fixed. And I couldn't participate in tough sports like football or 180-pound football because of that hernia. And fortunately, with my appointment to the academy, I had to get it fixed. So we scraped enough money together to fix that. And when I got to the Naval Academy, I said, well, why don't I try out for the fencing? And so I did. There was foil, there was épée, and there was saber. You could have one of those three weapons. So I picked the épée and got on the varsity team.
Wow.
Spent the last 2 years with parrying the other, mostly Ivy League schools on the East Coast.
A lot of competition?
A lot of competition from Harvard, Yale, all the Ivy League schools on the East Coast. So anyway, that was my sport. I also was editor-in-chief of the Trident magazine, which was a professional magazine gathering up articles on the Navy Air and on submarines and on surface craft and new weapon systems. It was a professional magazine that we put out monthly. So it gave me a chance to travel around Baltimore a little bit to get to meet the publishers. And since my dad was in the advertising business, I had a little bit of a foot in the door there. And so it was a very, very pleasant first-class year. And then I was lucky enough to meet a young lady when we first went back in the fall of '56. I was only 6 months away, well, 9 months away from graduating. And my roommate and I were out in town in Annapolis looking for a coffee maker. And these two young ladies were walking down the street, and
Great story.
my roommate and I saw them go into a hardware store, so we said, well, let's see if they've got a coffee pot over there in that hardware store. Well, that started a relationship with this lady right here. And
Wow.
that went right through until a proposal in the spring of '57 that we get married. Well, I graduated on the 7th of June in '57, and we were married 2 days later in the Catholic Church out in town. And so we then started our career together, and there it is 53 years later.
Wonderful. Wow.
So with 4 children, our 4 daughters. Unfortunately, we lost twin sons in between the 2 daughters and the next 2 daughters because of premature birth. Their lungs just couldn't handle it, and in the early '60s, you had to have the right medical treatment and right equipment to save preemies. So anyway, my first assignment after graduation was an APA, a troop carrier, and it was leaving to go to the Mediterranean. And it had good features and bad features. The bad features is I was leaving behind a wife who went up to Boston and stayed with family in Boston while I was off to the Mediterranean for 6 months. And then we found out that Janice was pregnant, and it was 9 months almost to a day that our first daughter arrived, 9 months after the honeymoon. And so I fortunately qualified as officer of the deck underway, both for solitary steaming and in formation steaming. You know, because the Alligator Navy always had lots of boats that they needed to help them out. We had a very good med cruise. I came back, and I was called on the quarterdeck watch that I was standing as an ensign, that I was the father of a proud new little lady.
That's how you got the news?
Yeah, it was a phone call from Boston.
Wow.
So I had the night duty watch, and I got relieved, and I jumped in my car and drove up to Boston, and we started a family. And after, well, in the first place, to get to sub school, you have to have been qualified as the OD underway. So I had that ticket punched, and I applied for sub school, and I got the first one available. So in the summer of '58, we were headed up to New London to attend a 6-month basic officer submarine school class, and graduated in December of '58. And my first assignment on that APA was based on drawing numbers out of a hat. So out of 848 people in the graduating class, I think my number came up like 750. So I didn't get a very good assignment the first time around, except that I did qualify for OD.
Yeah.
But the second time around, I got Hawaii as my duty station in the December of '58. So we put our daughter in the car, and we went out to the airport and got on an airplane, flew into Hawaii, and that was in January of '59. And all I can remember is all the wonderful aromas stepping off that airplane, with all the leis being put over your head and on your shoulders.
That's quite a greeting.
The plumeria and the tube roses and all the wonderful smells of Hawaii. So anyway, the Pacific submarine deployments, that was to a diesel boat, the USS Cuss SS-348. And they were scheduled to go to Westpac, as you mentioned, Western Pacific. And most of those deployments were 7.5 months. So there we were with number 1 daughter, and by that time, number 2 daughter was not far away. But I had to get all my training in and get my dolphins, and it took me a year to get my dolphins. And we deployed soon after reporting to that ship, and spent 7.5 months in Western Pacific ports, including Yokosuka in Japan. We called on in Kobe. We went to Hong Kong, and we had some special ops built into that. And by that time, the Cusk, which was the first submarine to fire a loon, it was a surface ship type arrangement where they had to surface, fire the loon, and then submerge.
But that was off of San Clemente, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. That was earlier days of the Cusk. She was the first one to fire air-breathing missiles. And then, of course, from the loon program came Regulus, and we ended up being not a launch boat, but one of the mid-range boats on the Cusk. And we had to provide guidance to that air-launched missile, air-breathing missile, at mid-range in order to get it on target. So then there were a couple of submarines that were built specifically as launchers for those air-breathing missiles. And one of those was Tunney, and she was out there in Pearl with us. So our deployments were built around perfecting the skills of the air-breathing missiles. And that was before the days of SSBNs, but they weren't far behind either.
No, the Polaris program was starting about then.
That's right. And I got my Dolphins. I had put in for nuclear school. I got that assignment right after qualifying in Dolphins. So I was only on Cuss for about 1.5 years, and then it was time to go to nuke school, which we went to in Mare Island, just north of San Francisco, and that was a full 1-year program. Unfortunately, Admiral Rickover didn't give you anything but a graduation certificate, but it really was an equivalent of a master's degree in nuclear engineering. So I always say, credited as nuclear engineering
You
degree.
didn't go to ARCO at all?
Oh yeah, I went to, the whole program was 1 year, 6 months academics, 6 months hands-on at the prototypes. And my prototype happened to be the aircraft carrier prototype, A1W, out in Idaho. So
Yes. Okay.
it was a bus ride of about an hour. We were living in Idaho Falls and went to school out there and qualified on A1W a year later. So then my first assignment was to USS John Marshall, which was under construction down in Newport News, shipbuilding dry dock. So we had to move again. Of course, we ended up making a total of 30 moves in 30 years. Some of them were only 6 months apart, some were a year or two apart, but 30 moves in 30 years.
Between the Navy and my company, I understand fully.
I'll tell you, we always tried to live slimly because, we were having garage sales all the time, so we didn't accumulate too much in the way of furniture.
It does help you keep your possessions under control.
And not only that, you have a weight limit that you can't exceed in shipping your household goods. Well, anyway, we finished building John Marshall, and I was the DCA and diving officer on that ship. And so I learned all the auxiliary equipments. That was a good training billet for me for this first time around. All the air purification, the oxygen generators, the CO2 scrubbers, the hydrogen burners, everything that involved our interior atmosphere, I was responsible for, as well as ballasting the ship to get it put together right, particularly coming out of new construction. You didn't necessarily trust the shipbuilder to balance that submarine correctly. So
we had some experiences, I'm sure you did too, coming
Yes,
out of the
yes.
shipyard.
one of them was after we came out of one of the shipyard periods, they reballasted Marshall. And the gold crew, I was on the blue crew. The gold crew was in charge of that sea trial. I'll never forget, I was in the control room, and we made our first dive after the reballasting by the shipyard. And Bob Dickinson was the gold crew skipper. And he asked the gold crew diving officer, "How does it look, Mr. Karakowitz?" I'm using a makeup name. And the diving officer said, "It looks good, Captain." He said, "Very well, blow all main ballast." He didn't like the answer that the diving officer gave, and we immediately popped up to the surface like a cork. And it turned out that we were 100,000 pounds overweight. And that skipper knew immediately when he pulled the diving alarm that we were so heavy we were going to hit bottom unless he surfaced immediately. So we avoided a grounding by the quick action of Bob Dickinson, our gold skipper. And awesome. Because the only way you could tell if it was ballasted correctly was looking at the water line alongside the pier. And of course you were not loaded out for sea at that time, so your water line was a little hard to figure out.
But the plimsoll marks weren't showing either.
No, you didn't have plimsoll marks yet. They're usually only put on after everything else has been calculated. At any rate, we finished a tour on Marshall. I deployed to Scotland for 3 patrols, 3 SSBN patrols. And it turns out they were all in the Mediterranean because we get deployed out of Scotland. Most of the deployments were aimed at the Soviet Union, and so the Mediterranean was a convenient place to hide.
And we didn't have Rota then.
We had Rota shortly thereafter, Rota, Spain, and that was another home port for SSBNs. So Holy Lock and Rota were the 2 home ports. And all the tender work was done at Rota and Holy Lock too, the repairs for the rotation. And so anyway, I made 3 patrols on John Marshall, and by that time I had gotten my ticket as an engineer, nuclear engineer, and I got assigned to my next submarine, which was Kamehameha. And Kamehameha was out in Mount Vallejo, California, and I went aboard as the blue engineer, the senior crew engineer. Well, my gold crew counterpart was Roger Bacon, whose father was an admiral in World War II, and he was eventually made admiral and was one of 3 sons that went into submarines out of that Bacon family. And he later made vice admiral. His brother, one of his brothers, made captain, and a third brother made commander. So all 3 of them were naval officers out of that family, besides the dad, who was, of course, also an admiral in World War II.
We've gone rather quickly over those trips that you made, because I have some things that I believe even today you're not going to talk about. But how long were those trips?
Well, the SSBN patrols were very fixed. They were normally 1 month alongside the tender, getting ready to deploy. 2 months at sea, you'd come back, you'd change over crews. A changeover, the new oncoming crew would be there for their 1 month of in-port period. They'd take it off for 2 months, and then you just keep that sequence going, rotating. So you're away from home basically half the time.
Yeah, when you were out there during your operational engineering time, you had much improved capability for making water, didn't you?
Oh yes, we had
compression stills that were used in the.
Well, we had a large still, an 8,000 gallon per day still that just turned out pure water. Of course, you were making up water both for the main propulsion generators, as well as all your other needs for water for the crew and water for washing and water for refilling the tanks for the boilers, steam boilers. So there was a huge demand for water. But then we had a lithium bromide air conditioning plant too. And of course, as A division officer, I learned all those basics right up at the get-go. So I was pretty well equipped to help my DCA and my A division officer solve any problems that came up, even as an engineer and later as a skipper. All those skills really built like a pyramid to give me, confidence. Well, I made one patrol on Kamehameha out in the Pacific. Naturally, with a name like Kamehameha, they had to take the ship around. We had to go through well, we didn't go through the Panama Canal. We went out to Hawaii from Mare Island. But the reception was downtown Honolulu, with all the sirens and the water boats and the fire boats and, shooting water into the air. What a reception.
That was awesome, yeah, with a name like that.
With a name like Kamehameha.
Yeah.
So anyway, we spent time out there. We went through PSA, post-shakedown availability, in a local yard in Mare Island. And then we went out on our first patrol, and that was out in the Pacific. And by that time, I had another ticket, and after Kamehameha, where do we go, hon?
Barb, wasn't it? Barb?
Well,
Yeah. You
did several.
It was time for me to go to XO. So I got an assignment to SSN 596 in Pearl. We stayed in Pearl, and I was on Barb from 67 through 69, basically. And we made several patrols off Kamchatka Peninsula. And it was during one of those patrols on Barb that the skipper had a bar mitzvah coming up for his son. Bud Carter was Jewish, of course, and he figured that 1 month after the end of the patrol as scheduled was enough slack time so that if we got extended, it should be enough. Well, it turns out that after we were on station for 60 days, we left station, we're headed back to Hawaii, and all of a sudden the entire Soviet fleet came out of their ports at Vladivostok and up north of the Arctic Circle. And the ComSub pack,
And they sent you right back.
they said, stay where you are, find out what's going on. We
Take
want to know what's going on.
Take pictures too.
Well, there wasn't much to take pictures of. It was the whole fleet coming out at us.
Yeah.
And we certainly didn't want to get detected because, you know, it was, the nature of the mission was figure out what they're doing,
Yeah.
not look at individual ships. Well, we figured it out after about 2 weeks that they were setting up a multi-ship screening pattern. They were searching in an expanding square.
For our presence.
They were actually looking for a Gulf class submarine,
A lost one.
a lost one, that had disappeared. Of course,
Okay.
the Gulfs carried at least 2 nuclear-tipped missiles in the sail. And that was a valuable asset for them to lose. And they didn't know where it was. There was never any word sent back to them. Emergency radio transmissions.
That was Gulf class that went down off Hawaii that we recovered part of, wasn't it?
Well, it was way north. It was about 1,000 miles north, up in the Marianas Trench. And we figured out what they were doing finally. Well, to make a long story short, he missed the bar mitzvah.
Golly.
So anyway, I think they gave him a Legion of Merit for figuring out what was going on, but he lost with his son because he didn't make the bar mitzvah.
Yeah. Those things do happen.
They do happen. So anyway, going back to that story, I finished a couple of Westpac type deployments on Barb. We were a very busy ship. We were underway most of the time.
Yeah, your op tempo was pretty heavy.
Very heavy, because we didn't have too many SSNs out in the Pacific to cover a huge ocean. I mean, it's at least twice the size of the Atlantic.
Well, part of that need was why they later moved a base to Guam
That's right,
in order to cut down the travel time.
right. We deployed a couple more, at least 2 to 3 more SSNs to Guam, and they would live in Guam with the families and deploy on Westpac trips, because the transit time was much, much shorter than it was in Hawaii, obviously. So anyway, I finished one patrol. I'm sorry. I finished all my deployments to Westpac.
Well, you were exec.
I was exec, so,
It's
right.
about ready for PCO school.
Well, yeah, but I had another assignment. I had built, John Marshall and Kamehameha, and they said, this guy's got lots of new construction experience. And in a way, that was good, because I wanted to be an architect to begin with. And instead of building buildings, I was building submarines.
Back to your model days.
Back to my novel days. So anyway, from Barb, I went to the sub-pack staff.
Okay.
And I was what they call the force nuke. I had a good nuclear background, 2 new constructions under my belt. I understood nuclear reactors and nuclear fission and all that stuff. So they said, we want you to go around and inspect every tender, and there were at least 3 tenders in the Pacific, 1 in Guam, there was 1 in San Diego, 2 in San Diego, and then there was sub-base in Pearl. So I had four home commands, base commands or ship commands that were dealing with radiological issues. Not only that, for new construction SSNs, I had to go around and interview their crews to get them up to speed for the Rickover team that came aboard, or sub-LANT or sub-PAC also established a nuclear examining team, the ORS board.
Is that for safety issues?
Operational reactor safety evaluations, yeah. So anyway, I was the force nuke. I flew 300,000 miles in 3 years on that assignment.
Was that before frequent flyers?
Yeah, I got no frequent flyer points. But I sure got a lot of airtime. And we flew all over the west coast of Asia, and Bremerton, and San Diego, and Guam, and Hong Kong, and Singapore. I mean, I was in the air most of the time. So after that, they said, okay, this guy's ready for a skipper. And we'll send him to our Rickover Charm School, they called it, in Washington, to groom me up to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything about nuclear power. So I went through that, and I reported to Pascagoula, Mississippi, to build the third and last SSN stretch hull that was built at Ingalls. And that's why we're sitting here today. We found this town in 72 or 3 when we were bringing the kids over to a little trip over here on this side of the world. And I think we took them to a circus, didn't we?
Pensacola Beach.
Pensacola Beach. At any rate, that was a great assignment. The guy I had for XO had a PhD in nuclear physics. So I think Rickover was giving me the highly qualified nuke as my XO. So we had a real strong team, not one that could fail.
Yes, you did.
One that won't fail. So anyway, we went through and flying colors all the way through all the exams and building the ship. And it took us 2 years to get the ship built. My dad rode the ship down on the launch, up in the cockpit at the top of the sail. And I've got his picture here, but Red Ramage, who was the World War II hero that fired 19 torpedoes in the space of about an hour, sank at least 3 heavy merchant ships.
In shallow water.
Well, yeah, they were in dangerous water.
Yeah.
And he conducted that entire attack on the surface at night.
Yeah.
And he received the Congressional Medal of Honor for that.
Well deserved.
And he attended that launching and sat next to Janice, or at least stood next to her when he was actually watching the ship go down the ways. And tears were rolling down his eyes.
I can understand it.
Because all those days on his ship that went through the Pacific War, and he did so well, and he couldn't believe that here we were with a nuke Parchie. And I'm sure all the things were going through his head. Hey, they don't have to recharge batteries every night. Hey, they don't have to worry about stale air. They got their own great air.
CO2, hydrogen, all the other issues.
Everybody smells pretty good, not like those big boat guys. So anyway, I finished out a 4-year command tour on Parchie, 2 years in construction and 2 years running around the Caribbean for WASAT, the Weapons System Acceptance Trials, and then the deployments. I went for a 6-month Mediterranean deployment.
During all of that time, no problems with the nuclear plant.
None. 0. No.
That's quite an achievement.
It was. But anyway, I participated in one NATO exercise against the Italians, the Spanish, some Dutch ships, and some American ships. And I was supposed to be the attack guy because I had the attack submarine. Well, what I did was I got under the oiler that was supplying the entire task force, and I just stayed underneath that oiler the whole time. And then I'd pull out at awkward times in the middle of watch change, and I'd come up periscope depth, and I'd sink a couple of ships. This is all not for real, of course, but I had the advantage because no one knew where I was or where I came from. And I was under that noisy oiler the whole time for that whole exercise. and I sank about half the entire fleet in that evolution. And they never figured out where I was.
And you had the speed to be able to do
I
it.
had the speed and maneuverability to choose wherever I wanted to go.
Mhm.
So that was quite an achievement.
Yes, it was. It was on the part sheet.
That was Parchi.
As I told you, my affinity with the Parchi was simply because that was the first submarine I set foot on. So I feel privileged to listen to you right now.
Yeah. Well, I didn't finish the story about the out there in the Pacific with trying to go after that, recover that Gulf submarine. Howard Hughes brought the Glomar Explorer into the action
Right.
picture. It turns out the Gulf and the Marianas Trench was way down there, over a mile deep. And they had never tried to recover or bring up a part of a submarine that deep. Well, there was a big argument between the CIA and SubPac rather, about whether they could bring up part of it or all of it. It's all discussed in this book. If anybody wants all the true facts.
That book is Blind Man's Bluff.
Blind Man's Bluff, The Untold Story of American Submarine Espionage. And it was, of course, all hell to pay when it first came out.
Yes. But
Because
fortunately, it was only part of the story.
Well, it was only part of the story, but there's enough truth in there that it's hard to sort out what's fact from fiction. Sherry Sontag, Christopher Drew, and Annette Drew, I think that's her daughter, were all hitched in with New York Times. So they put that book together, and there's that whole story about that recovery of that Gulf, or attempted recovery, is in there. It's a great book. It came out, I think, in '58.
It's on my library, too.
Did you read the whole thing?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
It's an exciting book.
It is.
It's hard to put down.
Yeah.
So anyway, they got it halfway up, and it fell apart. It was a crazy idea by the CIA. They wanted to bring the whole ship up. Well, you don't lift a multi-ton ship full of water after it's been sunk and trying to put it up to the surface and then lift it into a barge or something that can carry it. It just didn't work.
Well, part of the story about what they did in recovering some of the bodies off of there and the little funeral service that they had for those folks that they later, when the Cold War ended,
Yes.
you're familiar with some of that.
They turned that information over to the Soviets. But that was their major concern. They didn't want to destroy or disturb a grave of those brave sailors because they lost them all on that sinking. I guess they probably figured out what caused it. I don't know. But normally it's flooding. Just like with Scorpion and with Thresher, it was flooding. In Scorpion, they figured out it was probably a battery explosion in the forward battery that caused the initial damage.
On their way home.
On their way home. Yeah.
Yep. So.
All right. Then after, let's see, where are we?
You're still in nukes.
We're still. Well, I got orders off of Parchi, and where do we go from there, hon?
Well,
I believe that we went to New London, and then we went to Sardinia.
Yeah, it was. By that time, I had orders. After we went to New London, I went back to sub school for a while, and I was thinking about retiring.
you had two duties at sub school, didn't you?
Yeah, I had twin. Yeah, they were not together. They were separated. Yeah, I was a tactics instructor for the first one, advanced tactics, and the second one I ran the officer training program.
Okay.
So, but they were separated by a couple of years
and
at
we
least.
were into nukes then, so,
Oh, yeah.
so you had the experience to
Right.
be sure they were heading in that direction.
Right, but also the tactical experience.
Yes, which was very important in those days, because I believe, to whatever degree you can tell me, you had some extremely close encounters with Russian submarines.
Well, not close enough that I had sweat on my brow. We never had any near collision situations, never.
Good.
I always stayed at a respectable distance away from them because they had crazy Ivan maneuvers where they would go out and do a Williamson turn and head right back down at you. So if you were in there following close on their tail, all of a sudden you were going head to head with a head-on collision potential. And I never wanted to get into that situation.
No, no winners.
No winners.
Yeah.
That's right.
But somewhere along the line, towards the end of your career, you moved into an MBA program at.
I got that at night
Oh, you got that at night.
when I was on the staff at Subron 12 in New London. That was one reason. You know, I wanted to go back because I had a good tour there with Bruce DeMars, my classmate, who eventually relieved as Rickover's relief 2 or 3 times removed. And he made full admiral from that billet. He was a super guy. We still chat with Bruce and his wife when we go back for reunions.
You kept very close to a lot of the submarine folks that you
Grew up with.
grew up with.
Right.
Even in the brief time that I did also probably added. But tell me about some of those, because you just mentioned them. You still have close contacts with quite a few of them.
Well, yes, I do. And it's not only the nukes that involved, but also shipmates on various ships that we were on. I haven't gotten to a couple of things I need to tell you. One is I got command of the USS Orion, a submarine repair ship in La Maddalena, Sardinia, for 2 years. That was from 1980 to 82. And so a 2-year surface ship command, right there in.
Yeah, but that was all submarines.
Well, it was all submarines because I was a submarine repair ship.
Right.
But we were sitting there in beautiful La Maddalena, Sardinia, which is one of the most beautiful spots on Earth. And I could walk out of my cabin, my CO's cabin, and look down, water 30 feet deep, and I could see all the way to the bottom clearly. That water is so clean in that area. So anyway, I had a 2-year command tour on Orion, and we had to go out and rescue one of our submarines whose mushroom anchor was fully out, but could not be reeled in. And I mentioned the fact that I lost an anchor on the Orion. When I tried to go out where he was in about maybe 150 to 200 feet of water, and I walked my starboard anchor all the way down and had it touch. But to set it, I said, let go the starboard anchor for 10 fathoms. And that anchor just started, it had so much momentum from the weight of the chain, couldn't stop it. So I lost that anchor. But I gave up on that method. I went in, anchored my port anchor shallow in 20 feet of water, and then we sent my dive team out to attach a buoy to the end of their chain, blow it so that the buoy took the weight of their chain. I went back and I recovered his anchor a day later, and then went back to port, and he was free. He was tethered. He couldn't even come in to La Maddalena with his anchor dragging the ocean floor.
That's awesome. Talk about funny incidents.
Well, I managed to come away unscathed from that because they thought I'd drop the anchor from the surface all the way down to a deep moor, and I would never do that. I had to walk it out all the way, almost. And I thought it wouldn't really set unless I let it go for the last 10 fathoms. It was too much weight, too much momentum.
Well, we were taught that we just did a little backing in order to get the bite.
Yeah, well, I could have done that, but then I wasn't really close enough to get in to help him.
You were after recovery.
Yeah, I was going after a recovery.
Yeah, okay. Well, between the experience on the tender, and then you had your MBA, and you were, how did you get so lucky as to get naval attaché for 3 years?
Well, they called me up and they knew that I was in La Maddalena, that we lived there for 2 years, and we had a lot of exposure to language training. And so both Janice and I were not really rusty with Italian, but they put us through, they offered me the job of defense attaché to Italy for 3 years. And I called Janice and I said, honey, you were a Roman princess in a before life. What do you want me to do? Should I retire 3 years early, or should I stay for 30 and take the Rome job? Well, you guessed it.
You took 3 years, 3 happy years, I think.
But she was a Roman princess, I had to go.
How wonderful.
So anyway, we had a great time. The only thing was, it was during the height of the Middle Eastern assassinations. And of course, Italy has got so much open shoreline, it's very easy for people that want to do you harm to slip us ashore during the middle of the night in a boat, and you'll never find them again, particularly if they're trained as saboteurs and or assassins or terrorists. And I had the strike on Libya to try to get Gaddafi, who was creating so much problem. I was left with 3 carrier battle groups I had to find anchorages or moorings for in Italy. And Italy was brave enough to accept those 3 carrier task groups because they were taking on an awful lot of responsibility with already a record of Middle Eastern terrorism striking Italy.
Well, you told me at another occasion that one of our attachés, I believe it was in Greece, was assassinated during that era.
That's right.
You were a potential target yourself.
Exactly. And we had a lot of warnings. I had to vary my daily routine. I always traveled in armored cars. I always had drivers, native Italian drivers, assigned to the embassy. So we only had one circumstance when some of our children were with us. I guess almost all the children, except Rochelle wasn't there, was she?
Like 3, I think.
We had 3 out of 4 daughters. And we were out, and I had a BMW at that time with no controls on the emissions or anything, so that thing went like a jackrabbit. It was a 528i, which I had out on the autostrada doing 135 miles an hour. And we had these cops, when we were out driving around Rome one afternoon, with big lollipops. You know, the cops, if they want you to stop, they hold up this big circular lollipop stop sign. And we thought that they were dressed very slackly, slovenly. They didn't look like policemen. They didn't have police uniforms on. And so they wanted me to stop because I had one extra person in the back seat, as it turns out. One extra in the back seat. And that's what they were going to stop us for. But I said, get down, kids, and I took off. Well, we went directly to the ambassador's residence, drove in so that we at least had cover if these guys were going to chase us.
I have one more question and let you wrap up. During the decoration list that I looked at that was quite substantial, including that special one from the government of Italy.
Right.
But my understanding is that that's only part of the picture. You have a number of awards and recognitions that will never see the light of day. Is that true?
Not really. There's one other thing that I have here that you might be interested in, signed by and that was for my Cold War service. But all the rest are legitimate awards. Because I didn't get into the super spook business on Parchi because I was an Atlantic sailor. All that happened in the Pacific until later up off the White Sea.
Okay, very good.
Okay?
Well, you've had a remarkable career, and I'm glad that your tour of duty in Pascagoula
Turned into this.
let you drop anchor here.
And it's an anchor that I want to acknowledge, not one that I lost.
And I consider it my personal privilege to have this opportunity to share some time with you.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
The Italian medal.
Yeah, he mentioned it.
Oh, he did?
Well, I did mention only, but the name of it, let me see here. It's,
I can give you the Italian name.
well, I'd rather have you. You were knighted by the President of Italy.
Yes, the official title of that is Un Cavaliere Militare Ufficiale della Repubblica Italiana. That's their...
It's your program. I'm keeping my mouth shut.
That's the official name of that award, which is
Well,
equivalent.
that was a tremendous honor.
Cavaliero is a horseman or a knight on horseback, and so that's their knighthood.
And
It doesn't quite measure up to an English knighthood.
well, in many ways, with the risks you were taking with the events that were going on in the Mediterranean world at that time, I think that's pretty special, and you're a pretty special guy.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Okay, very good. Thank you, folks.
That was a wonderful, wonderful interviewer.
Yes.